understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time. John and I are sitting here in the basement. We are exchanging parenting skill advice.
It's like a therapy session.
Which is very, very pathetic. Which is two fathers who hate any sort of conflict and therefore back down on every issue. There are no boundaries.
Yes.
You know, it's like, you got to establish boundaries with your children. There are no boundaries. There are no rules. It is a pathetic form of deflated middle-aged manhood.
Yeah. Well, if we haven't cracked it by now, I think that's it. We're done.
Gone. So if you have any parenting skills of how rather soft-focused fathers can establish boundaries, rules, agendas, all that, by all means, just hook us up on Twitter at David MacW, and we will both be reading them and
taking notes furiously.
Anyway, how are you? I hope you're well. It is a couple of days to go to Liberation Day, John.
Liberation Day, woo!
Liberation Day is what Donald Trump refers to as the day he imposes tariffs on all and sundry. I want to start by talking about a friend of the podcast who you will remember if you go back and you'll have a search, Jeff Goldberg.
Oh, yes.
So Jeff Goldberg is an old mate of mine. He's the editor of The Atlantic. He has been on the podcast. And this week, of course, he was
on the rack now.
He was on the rack, but he was also on the WhatsApp group that he shouldn't have been on. Yes. It's like, ooh, Jeff is typing. JD is typing. But that, so you know we're referring to the editor of The Atlantic was included in a highly, highly, allegedly secretive WhatsApp group, which was planning an American bombardment of Yemen. And of course, Goldberg doesn't respond. He just says, I've been added to a group. And he says, is that JD Vance in this group?
Yeah.
Is that the defense secretary, etc.?
Yeah, it was the whole thing. Like, how could somebody add him to a group? Because you'd have to go through his contacts list and then pick him out and go, bump.
Well, we're not talking about the most clever men in the world, John. We are
Clearly.
Not. But what I want to talk about is what that conversation told us about their worldview and how that worldview feeds into the tariffs this week, and how those tariffs this week will feed into global economic outlook and Irish economic outlook, but British as well, Australian, Canadian. Of course, the Canadians have gone all hard ass on them, right? But what this group and this WhatsApp group revealed was the type of internal thinking, particularly with respect to Europe, because it's all about tariffing the Europeans this week. Vance said and this is I quote, I just hate bailing Europe out again. And then Hegseth, the defense secretary, said, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. So your loathing of freeloading, it's pathetic, right? So what they were talking about was the Americans were going to bomb the Houthis in order to keep global trade flowing through the Suez Canal. The only objection that J.D. Vance had for that was that American trade is only fractional coming from the Red Sea, but it's a largely European affair. So in his worldview, that would be, again, the American military bailing out these cheese-eating surrender monkeys of France, Germany, Britain, etc. Now, what that shows, John, is this extraordinary antipathy towards the European Union. And it's very, very deep, and it's shared by all of them. But I think in particular, J.D. Vance, he seems to be uniquely animated by the fact that Europe is the enemy. And this can only be sourced in his absolute hatred of what you would call the European way of life. And the European way of life would be tolerant, liberal, LGBT-friendly, post-religious, all the sort of stuff that the Europeans suggest makes our quality of life better, but all the sort of stuff that not only the Europeans suggest, that all economic indicators and social indicators say the best place to be born in the history of humanity is Northwestern Europe in the last 50 years.
Dún Laoghaire in particular.
Dún Laoghaire in particular, exactly. This end of Dún Laoghaire as well, not the swanky end. This end of Dún Laoghaire, right? The more honky-tonk end of Dún Laoghaire.
But this must have been festering. It feels like this has just come out of the blue. And it kind of has in many ways. But it must have been festering for years.
I think it's festering for years. And I think this is how MAGA killed the woke movement. As far as J.D. Vance and Hegseth and all those sort of testosterone-driven fellas is that Europe is effete, effeminate, socialist, lazy, unproductive, living off past glories. And now, of course, we are infested with Islam and immigrants from Africa and all that sort of stuff, all of which there is an element of truth in all this.
Yeah.
But it seems to be driving policy. Again, I come back to the question we asked ourselves about 2 weeks ago. Why are the Americans imposing tariffs on Canadians and Europeans, their erstwhile number one allies? And it must be that they hate something about us more than they dislike Mr. Putin or President Xi.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the extraordinary thing about tariffs, we're going to talk all about tariffs today, is China, which is the source of most of their angst, is actually being treated far better than Europe, which is the source of most of their friendship.
Yeah.
So I think, look, all these recent podcasts have all been about the repositioning, the reframing, the realignment of the world. I think the most plausible explanation for all of this is that Americans, or the American administration, sees international trade and trade policy as an extension of a culture war. And it is trying to get even with people that it believes have slighted them. And as a result of that, there is no logic economically, financially, or monetarily to the trade policy and the tariff war, unless you see it through the lens of a sort of vindictiveness towards what they would regard as lily-livered pansies in Europe and Canada who are unmanly, unmasculine, and un-American.
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And of course, Putin is the opposite. Putin's a tough guy, and we're tough guys.
Yeah.
And you know, he rides bare-chested on fucking polar bears or whatever he does, right? So, be that as it may, we still have to, on the podcast, explain tariffs and what they do. So, I am going to bring you back, John, to a movie, because John's always a movie buff, always preferred movies to me, not to me, but rather than me or above me. I was never really a movie buff.
It was my escape from Mac. I go watch a movie.
I don't want to go out and play football with you. I'm just going to go watch the movie. But there was a movie from the 80s called Ferris Bueller's Day Off when we were, I think, in school, right? And it was about
fantastic movie.
It was about a guy, Matthew Broderick, who was the main actor, who spends a huge amount of his time in Donegal because he is married to Sarah Jessica Parker.
Yeah.
They have a house, I think, in Kilgar in Donegal.
Oh, I didn't
and they
know that.
spend about 2 or 3 months a year up there in Donegal.
And by the way, Ferris Bueller's best mate in the movie turned out to be Khan in Succession. Same actor.
The loser brother.
The loser brother, the eldest brother.
Who went to be president.
Yes. Yeah.
Hey, Khan.
he was brilliant in that.
Anyway, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is about a fella who goes mitching in Chicago on the final day or just before he's supposed to graduate from high school. So it's an American high school movie. It's a comedy. It's kind of hilarious, but there's a scene in it. So everybody on our road wanted to be either Ferris Bueller or one of the lads going out, one of the hot chicks, okay? Of course, I wanted to be the guy you're going to hear now, who is an actor called Ben Stein, and he plays the uber nerd in Ferris Bueller, and he's portrayed as the economics teacher.
Oh.
So when they were trying to get, the scriptwriters were trying to get the biggest nerd they could possibly get, the biggest turnoff, the guy who really didn't connect with the teenagers at all, they got not the geography teacher, not the religion teacher, the economics teacher. Now, fascinatingly, Ben Stein, who you're about to hear, trying to explain tariffs to 17-year-olds, right? And anybody who's been in economics class in school will remember exactly this reaction. But he wrote this entire scene himself,
Oh, right. Okay.
completely unscripted. And his dad, Herbert Steen, was the economic advisor to Richard Nixon in real life.
Oh, right. Okay.
So,
Brilliant.
yeah, isn't it? So listen up here. All of you economics students, by the way, I'm teaching economics in Trinity. My course in Trinity starts on Monday. We were going to make that available on Patreon, patreon.com/David McWilliams over the course of the next few weeks. It will not be like this.
Yes.
Okay? But here it is, John.
It's a matter of style of teaching.
Exactly.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
So that was me as Ben Steen and John as the silent pupils.
I was the one who was drooling on the desk asleep.
So you have just got a snapshot of our teenage years. Anyone? Now, the fantastic thing about that clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off is it deals with two issues we're going to deal with today.
Yes.
One is tariffs. John's lazy. He's actually asleep again.
Truly.
He's truly. I'm going to caragum dulamach with the Alaris. The first one is tariffs. We're going to discuss. Smoot Hawley. You heard him say that.
Smoot Hawley, yeah.
And also, interestingly, the Laffer curve.
Decades
later, we are using Ferris Bueller's Day Off to explain economics.
I love
Perfect.
it.
Right.
I love it.
So,
Smooler. Who is Smooler?
Smoot and Hawley.
Smoot and Hawley.
Smoot and Hawley, right?
Okay. I was paying attention.
I tell you, it's like I feel like a frustrated economics teacher with a child here. Right? Okay, Smoot and Hawley, right? They were two congressmen. And in 1930, they forced through Congress a whole series of tariffs in order to insulate, they believed, America from foreign competition. And they suggested that the foreign competition was the source of all America's ills. Now, let's just go back. This is a period of unbelievable economic uncertainty. This is just after the Great Crash. This is when the United States economy is beginning to significantly contract. Why? Because not just companies were exposed to the collapse in shares in 1929, but in the United States, as is the case now, and as was the case then, punters were involved in the stock market. Whereas in Europe, punters were not involved at all. To a degree.
Oh, okay.
So basically what you had is the United States always has had this speculative culture, right? This is, when de Tocqueville, that great French aristocrat, went to write about America, what he couldn't understand in the 1840s was the American obsession with money. That money was the arbiter in the United States. And everybody talked about money, everybody tried to understand money, and everybody based their perceptions of people's status on money. Whereas in Europe, it was all aristocracy and intellectuals and all that sort of carry on, right?
Should have read your book.
Should have read my book. Listen, we've backdated to the 1840s. By the way, it is coming out in the United States in next November, which we're going to do we have to do all sorts of American tours for that. So to come back, John, to Smoot Hawley, I'm reading this morning a book, which is a very good book called The Lords of Finance, 1929, The Great Depression and the Bankers Who Broke the World, by a guy called Liaquat Ahmed. Really, really good book. And he's talking about Smoot Hawley, but he's talking about the fact, he makes the point, and it's a really good point, that The problem in America wasn't tariffs. The problem was the gold standard. And the problem for the Americans and for the global economy was that when people started to get nervous about stock markets and financial markets, money flowed back into the United States, right? Because the United States had less debt, no debt. It was the world's creditor nation, and it was far away from hassle. Right? It was far away from potential wars in Europe, potential fascist movements in Europe, all that sort of stuff that was emerging in Europe at the time, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a perception, hold on a second, let's get our money back to America. Ironically, within Europe, where money actually went, wasn't Britain or Germany, which were the more dynamic economies, money went to France. France was seen in Europe as a safe haven, which was unusual because the French economy was slightly more lugubrious than the other economies. But in general, money flowed back to America. So what happened when money flowed back to America, it meant that there was an investment deterioration all around the world. There was basically no cash.
Right.
Because back then, in order to expand your money supply, you had to have gold. And if all the gold went back to America, that was a problem.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just ask you, what did America do with this extra cash back sloshing around?
Now, this is the whole point, right? So what the Americans should have done was encourage the banking system to lend. But the problem at the time was after the crash, there was a total collapse in confidence. And even though the Federal Reserve reduced interest rates dramatically, the economy was caught in what Keynes described as a liquidity trap. He actually described it very eloquently as pushing on a string. So you imagine trying to push something on a string. Right. So which can't be done.
Explain a liquidity trap.
The liquidity trap is when the companies and individuals have too much debt, and therefore it doesn't matter how low the interest rates go, they still have an aversion to debt because they've built up so much.
Right.
That's the first thing. And the banks have too much bad debt. So it doesn't matter how low the interest rate go, they will not be encouraged to lend because they've been burnt. So a liquidity trap describes when the economy is trapped, the rate of interest no longer sparks investment. People have too much bad debt and bad experience, so they retrench and hoard. And the banks have also too much bad debt in their balance sheet, so they retrench. So therefore, cutting interest rates doesn't help.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the essential alchemy of Keynesianism. If the economy is in a liquidity trap, you cannot depend on monetary policy, which is cutting interest rates, to kickstart the economy. You have to do something else. In fact, back to this book, John, Keynes described this as a magneto problem. Now, a magneto was a device that was commonly in use for creating the electric spark in the ignition of a car in the 1920s.
Right.
A magneto, very old sort of word, right? We've gone out of use. But what Keynes said is we have a magneto problem, i.e. the economy needs a spark.
Yeah.
And we cannot achieve this by interest rates because we're in a liquidity trap. And why are we in a liquidity trap? Because we incurred far too much debt in the 1920s before the crash, okay? And that was the case.
But interest rates are the main tool for creating that spark. So they're not using that. So what can they use?
So what Keynes said is the government has to come in and has to basically create its own demand. So you've got to build dams, you've got to build roads, you've got to build electrical, this, that, and the other, right? So the essential argument of Keynesianism is that when an economy finds itself in a liquidity trap, as it does tend to after a period of great expansion, because the debt levels are so overburdening that balance sheets need to be cleared up, and that takes time. What you will find is that by cutting interest rates alone, nothing will happen. So the government then has to come in and take up the demand. It's what's called counter-cyclical economic policy. So when the economic cycle goes downwards and people retrench and people hoard and people save because they're nervous about the future, the government has to take on the mantle of being the leader and expand the economy. And then that will kick into what Keynes called a multiplier effect. That look, so for example, if you get a job, chances are you're going to spend a little bit more. Let's say you get a job in the States, chances are you're going to spend a little bit more. That spending multiplies into the retailer. They make a little bit more profit. They employ somebody else. they spend. And what so Keynes was saying is that over time, as long as the state comes in, you will actually generate what they call the economic multiplier. And Bob's your uncle, animal spirits, which is people's perceptions of confidence, will come back, and the memories of the recession will fade, the memories of the losses will fade, and Bob's your uncle, we're back again into the cycle.
But this obviously takes time.
This takes time.
And are we, or is America, in a liquidity
Now,
trap?
this is very interesting.
Now.
So just on the Smoot-Hawley, just one last thing on Smoot. So just when confidence was at its lowest ebb, the Americans took the decision to isolate themselves from the world with these very, very high tariffs.
Right.
And what that did was that knocked confidence yet further, because they thought, okay, we're not going to trade. And fascinating, at the time, America only did 3% of GDP in trade. Now only does 11%. So it's not much. I
Right.
mean, so the amazing thing about America now is that we're talking about trade, but the Americans import about 14% of their GDP and they export about 11% of their GDP.
Right.
So that means there's a 3% trade deficit every
Yeah.
year. But it's
all, actually.
it's very, very little.
Yeah. Okay.
Ireland
You-
imports
you
and
think-
exports are about 180% of GDP. We are the most open economy in the world. They're one of the most closed economies in the world.
Right.
So all this tariff stuff for America isn't going to make a huge difference, because actually $9 out of every 10 in America are internally generated. Right?
Okay.
So-
but the way Trump goes on, you'd swear it was a massive,
Well, so
massive.
this is what this is why you
deficit.
listen to the podcast,
Yeah.
to get the clarity. So this is why I make the point that this is part of a culture war, affixed onto a trade war that doesn't make any sense. Because if the Americans were like us and they had a massive open economy, which was open to inputs, outputs, all sorts of things all the time, that basically Ireland is like one massive laundromat. And I mean the laundromat, not in the things of washing money, although some would argue we do that
Yes.
a little bit, but it's just stuff comes in, it goes out, it's made here, so we are totally exposed to this world. The Americans are not really exposed at all. It's, as I said, it's 10% of the economy, more or give or take, right? Back then, it was only 4% of the economy.
Right.
But it was that sense that we are now going to close ourselves off from the Canadians and the Europeans that exacerbated the sense of crisis, which propelled yet more people to save and to hoard. And of course, the problem with savings and hoardings, if nobody is borrowing, the people who lend money have no income.
Yeah.
And the people who lend money was the banking system. So the next thing to go in America was the banking system in the 1930s. Smoot and Hawley were only one-term congressmen. They both lost their seats.
Right.
So tragic was the policy, right?
Yeah.
This is the policy that Trump is following.
Right.
We know from history that this policy makes no sense.
Did Smoot and Hawley, did
They
they?
sound like a gun or something. Don't they? Smoot and Hawley.
Yeah, absolutely. Or a law firm.
No, exactly. What do they call them in America? A white shoe law firm.
Oh, right.
That's
What's
the
a white
that's
shoe?
that's the expression for a really swanky law firm in New York.
Oh, right, white shoe.
White shoes, right? Because have you noticed that some American, another very, very bad fashion taste. Not that, by the way, looking at John and I on a Saturday morning, you would think we were not hardly going down the catwalk, the pair of us. But the white shoe was a type of upper crust wasp who wore white shoes in the
Right.
summer.
Ah, okay.
And they were always very waspy.
yeah. Yeah.
They've now subsequently become more Jewish. Most of the big firms are Jewish, but in the old days,
Yeah.
they were waspy. And they were called the White Shoe Law Firm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Smoot and Hawley.
Smoot and Hawley. But so we spoke about this before on the podcast about McKinley and
Yeah.
his isolationism and putting up
Yeah.
tariffs and all the
Yeah.
rest. That ultimately didn't work.
Didn't work, no.
So did they not kind of, because, it was only a few years after
Well,
McKinley.
In fairness to Smoot and Hawley, we're talking about depression thinking.
Mm.
And it's always easier in a depression to retrench and to shy away from competition in the outside world and basically look inward.
Yeah.
Whereas the key to economics, as I've always said, is macroeconomics is counterintuitive. Just when you think it's normal to be pessimistic, you need to be optimistic. And just when everybody is optimistic, that's when you should be pessimistic. simply because the contrarian view in economics tends typically at tipping points to be right. So when everybody's greedy in markets, that's the time for you to be parsimonious. And when everybody is parsimonious is the time to be greedy, right? This is counter-cyclical. So I think Smoot and Hawley were just reflecting an America that was slightly traumatized from the Great Depression.
Yeah. They were Republicans, by the way, were they?
Yeah. Now, Donald Trump comes in at a very different time. And there's always been in the Republican Party a sort of an isolationist worldview. Even we go back to, for example, the great cleavage in the founding fathers in America was between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson being a Republican, Hamilton being a Federalist. And the Federalist Party was basically his party. And the Republicans had this sort of, some of them at least, like John Adams and Jefferson, had this sort of almost De Valera-esque view of America, that they'd close off their borders, they'd create this beautiful republic, it would be flamboyantly tolerant, but they really wouldn't involve themselves in the world.
Yeah.
And they would create a second Jerusalem, as they talked about it, in the United States. And this is the whole metaphors of the shining city on the hill and manifest destiny and all that sort of stuff. And that was all broken basically by Roosevelt, first by Woodrow Wilson, then by Roosevelt. But beginning was our friend McKinley, who had a couple of wars,
Right,
but then
okay.
Woodrow Wilson, then Roosevelt, and then after the Second World War, America became a global colossus. But to get back to Smoot and Hawley, fascinatingly, the lessons for Smoot and Hawley was that tariffs do not kickstart the engine that is necessary. And therefore, that's why I conclude that what's going on is more of a culture war. And of course, the trade deficit in Trump's head is indicative of America being cheated, which shows a profound lack of understanding about how balance of payments actually work, which is where our friend Laffer from Ferris Bueller comes in.
Okay, let's talk about Laffer then. After a few tariffs.
After laugh.
Adams,
Here.
Adamley,
Here.
Adamowski, Adamson,
Here.
Adler,
Here.
Anderson, Anderson,
Here.
Bueller, 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 Bueller.
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
So that, of course, was another scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which again, I remember John's ability to mitch was the stuff of legend.
Do you know what? I never mitched in my life.
John got
I
these,
pulled a sickie.
the sick, we just call him sick note. He would get sick all the time.
So that was what? That was 1986.
85, 84, 85, around that, around then, yeah.
So why was he referencing the likes of Smoot, Hawley and Laffer?
Because they knew that many decades later, two lads in a basement wanted to set up a discussion about tariffs and needed a little bit of a humorous intro. No. So, because at the time, you're talking about Reaganomics. Ronald Reagan comes in. You are talking about a period where Americans begin to focus on economic policy in a way in which they hadn't done before, because they were going through actually what they subsequently referred to as a supply side revolution. Now, I, of course, in school, swatty pants here, thought this is all very interesting. But you, Bueller, was sick note, right? Didn't like it at all. And it is fascinating with the way culture picks up on these things. Actually, it always does, you know?
Yeah.
But the reference to voodoo economics and the Laffer curve were fascinating there, because that explains, ironically now, why the Americans have a large trade deficit.
Oh, okay. Explain that one.
So up until the late 1970s, the United States always ran a trade surplus. Small, but a trade surplus. Big country. So the question is, what happened in and around the time of Ferris Bueller's Day Off that the Americans started running trade deficits. Why did that become part of the conversational background noise, such that when the scriptwriters of Ferris Bueller's Day Off put it in the script, it didn't seem weird. It didn't seem something that people wouldn't have been talked about because they were talking about it.
Yeah.
So this comes back to lessons in the balance payments, part 1. Okay. John is now drooling. He's looking. He's saying, please.
Sliding under the desk.
Yeah, let me out of here. What did I do to deserve this? Right. So the interesting thing about the balance of payments is that the balance of payments always balances. So if you have a trade deficit in trade, which is that you are buying more than you are selling, you will tend typically also to have a deficit in the services side. Now, the reason is the following, is that every time Americans want to buy foreign goods, they have to buy foreign currency
Yeah.
to buy those goods.
Yeah.
And how do they get that foreign currency? They sell something to foreigners to get the currency. And look at it the other way around, is that every time foreigners buy some asset in America, they therefore have to buy dollars in order to buy that asset.
Yeah.
So basically what you find is that in a situation where a country has a trade deficit, they will normally have a surplus on some other side. Now, what does that mean? So take, for example, the reason America has a trade deficit. There's 5 steps, okay? This is real secondary school.
Yeah, go on.
John is now taking his notes. He's like, will that question be on the exam, sir? Will that be on the
Borrow
exam?
a pen.
Right. So basically, at the moment, right, foreigners like investing in the United States. There are better opportunities. The economy is growing faster. There's more productivity. There's more technological innovation in certain areas of the United States, right? So that's the first stage. Foreigners choose to invest in America. That's number 1. In order to do that, they need to buy dollars,
Yeah.
right? In order to buy dollars, they need to sell their own currency. So the price of the dollar goes up against all other currencies. The dollar appreciates.
Yeah.
As the dollar appreciates, goods, stuff that is made in America, for example, like cars, becomes much more expensive to export, and it becomes much cheaper to import Toyotas, right, than it is to export Chevrolets. We're very 1980s here, okay?
Yeah.
So over time, as that continues to happen, what you will get is you will get a trade deficit. So what's causing the trade deficit is the original purchase of American assets. Now, if you do this over time, 2 things happen, right? Over a long period of time, as the Americans have been doing it. One is, as the dollar appreciates, it means that the purchasing power of Americans increases dramatically, right? But it means making stuff in America becomes much more expensive.
Yeah.
So what happens, as the purchasing power of Americans increases, they buy more imports, so your trade deficit expands, but something else happens, which is, if people are buying dollars, and if the demand for dollars is going up, and if the price of dollars are going up, it also means that the chances are the rate of interest in America will be going down, okay? Because money's flowing into America.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is, as the rate of interest falls, what you'll find is this weird combination of a very high exchange rate and reasonably low interest rates encourages financial and real estate speculation.
Right. Okay.
So this is how you can explain how Wall Street has got very, very rich in the last 40 years. Because as the dollar appreciated, making stuff in America became much less attractive. But financial engineering in America became much more attractive. So more and more of the gains in the economy were going to people who were essentially speculators. I'll give you another great 1980s reference. You remember the movie Wall Street?
Yes.
Right? Gordon Gekko.
Gordon Gekko.
And Gordon Gekko was involved in a fight with Martin Sheehan.
Yeah.
And Martin Sheehan was a trade union man.
Yeah.
And Martin Sheen's son, Charlie Sheehan, was working for Gordon Gekko.
Yeah.
And what Gekko was trying to do was break up the airline business.
The airline,
right?
Yeah.
This is exactly what Ferris Bueller was predicting, although he didn't know it because he was asleep at the time, right? Okay. So we had two great 1980s movies, right? And the reason was the following, John, that as the dollar appreciated in the 1980s, the ability of the Americans to export, for example, technology or make planes diminished. And the only way that those American companies that were making real stuff could be made profitable was to break them up and sell them in little individual bits, which is what the corporate raider Gordon Gekko was doing, who was based on a real person called Carl Icahn, who is still around.
Right, okay.
And a lovely fella.
Did he go to prison?
Icahn, no. No, he didn't go to prison. He didn't go to prison.
Ah.
That's the thing about America. White-collar crime doesn't pay unless you're really rich. And then you get away. Then you become a billionaire and you get in Trump's cabinet.
Yes, exactly.
So I come back to the idea. And then the question is, why, we'll end here, in the 1980s, did foreigners start buying American assets? And this is where Laffer comes in.
Go on.
So Arthur Laffer was an economist who was employed by Ronald Reagan to tell Ronald Reagan what he wanted to hear.
Okay.
In general, that's what bigwigs employ economists to do if they are of the slightly autocratic or ideological bent. So, for example, it doesn't matter who Trump employs. The economists who are employed by Trump are there to tell Trump what he wants to hear.
Yeah, you're doing a great job, Trump.
You're the best ever, right?
Many people say.
Many people say, they say, right? So, Laffer whispered in Reagan's ear and said, if you cut taxes, you will generate so much economic activity that you will get more revenue, not less revenue, and you will balance the budget. Reagan loved the sounds of this. So he could be a fiscal conservative and a tax cutter at the same time.
Yeah.
Because it was all bogus. It was voodoo economics, according to Ben Steen, the mini-me in Bueller's Day Off, right? So what actually happened was the Americans cut taxes, the economy roared ahead, but it didn't generate enough extra revenue, so they were running a big budget deficit. So how do you pay for your budget deficit? You issue treasuries, which are basically IOUs to foreigners.
Yeah.
And you say to foreigners, buy our stuff. So as the foreigners started, and that's Europeans and Japanese, started buying American treasuries, exactly the same dynamic we outlined before happened. The dollar started to appreciate.
Yes.
As the dollar appreciated, American manufacturing became even less competitive and the trade deficit got bigger, not smaller. And that's where the Plaza Accords came in, which we spoke about last week, where they tried to engineer a reduction in the value of the dollar because the Americans realized we are actually becoming a de-industrialized country.
Yeah.
So fascinatingly, all this stuff, Laffer curves, American trade deficits, American current account deficits, American budget deficits, are all encapsulated fantastically in that 1 minute and a half scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So on Liberation Day, what we should advise all the listeners of the Dave McWilliams podcast to do is not pick up the Lords of Finance or some highfalutin economics book, but to go back
And watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
on your VCR.
VCR.
We'll talk to you.